Good morning, everyone. In today's lecture, we will be exploring Germany's years of domination in Europe early in the Second World War. Whilst the story of Germany's blitzkrieg tactics and rapid conquests on the continent is told in your textbook, in our lecture we will focus on the ways in which the Germans proposed an alternative vision for Europe, as well as examining Hitler's European allies who supported his views. Europeans had expected the Second World War to proceed like the First, a long, attritional struggle in the trenches in which a Royal Navy blockade would prove to be the decisive factor. The German army's stunning victories in the spring of 1940, in which they used tanks and dive bombers to smash through the weak spots of their opponents' lines, shocked everyone. The far right throughout Europe was jubilant and proclaimed the end of democracy and Marxism, as well as the coming of a new world order. We shall look at the way the German victories were greeted in a number of countries before examining the subsequent disappointment when it became apparent that the Nazis wished to establish a German racial hegemony on the continent, rather than to create a union of equal fascist states. Norway was conquered in April 1940 in a messy campaign which saw both sides take heavier losses than expected. Vidkun Quisling, an army veteran and former Minister of Defense, led the small Norwegian National Union Party. This party stood for a platform of anti-communism and anti-trade unionism, but had never obtained a single seat in parliament. This did not stop Quisling from visiting Hitler in December 1939 and proclaiming a so-called national government on April 9, 1940. Following a break of 2 years, Quisling reassumed power in 1942 and attempted to force a National Socialist curriculum in the schools and a fascist service in the churches. His National Union Party reached a peak in support in 1943. Norse paganism and myths of a Nordic racial purity were important for Norwegian fascists who wished to recreate a romantic Viking ethno-state. Quisling and his party were hated, however, by the majority of Norwegians, and their control of the country was always dependent on the German army, which violently suppressed dissent. Quisling was executed following the Nazis' defeat. The Germans took Belgium in May 1940 and received praise in both the Dutch and French parts of the country, known as Flanders and Wallonia respectively. In Flanders, the Flemish National Union collaborated extensively with the Germans in the hope of achieving unification with the Netherlands, which they considered to be their motherland. The Nazis, however, viewed the Dutch as misled Germans and made no attempt to allow Flanders to join the Netherlands. Flemish volunteers also joined the SS to fight communism in the so-called Flemish Legion, as well as actively and enthusiastically persecuting Jewish Belgians, helping to organize their deportation east, and massacring the Jews of Antwerp in 1941. In Wallonia, the Rex Party called for the masses to establish a right-wing revolution and to re-establish the dominance of the Catholic Church in Belgium. Originally styling his party along the lines of fellow Catholic Franco in Spain, Rex's leader, Leon de Grauw, moved closer to Hitler as the war went on, signing up in the SS and serving in the Eastern Front. He was never executed for his crimes, fleeing to Spain after the war. Perhaps the Germans' most infamous follower was the fascist regime established in southern France, following the fall of the Third Republic in 1940. Known as Vichy France for the town in which it was established, the regime, which only ever ruled half of France, was dominated by war hero Philippe Pétain and Pierre Laval, Pétain's vice premier, who emerged as the strongman of the new government. Laval, convinced that Germany had won the war and would now control the continent, saw it as his duty to adapt France to the new authoritarian age. He persuaded the French Parliament to vote itself and the Third Republic out of existence. This left Pétain in complete control, and he and his advisers embarked on a series of reforms which they labelled the National Revolution. Soon, the elements of a fascist state began to emerge, and steps were taken to decentralize France by reviving the old provinces. In the early stages of Vichy, Petain's inner circle, with the exception of Laval, was made up of right-wing traditionalists and authoritarians. The more hardline fascists settled in German-occupied France in the north, where they worked extensively with the German forces. Hitler had no interest in working with the Vichy government, no matter what the French said to convince themselves otherwise. He tolerated Vichy for the calm it brought to southern France, but otherwise it was not in his thoughts at all. Occupied France was run in a brutal, extractive manner, drained of every last resource that it could provide. These extractions increased after the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, following which French labourers were even conscripted to work away in German factories. It was no surprise that ordinary Frenchmen began to turn away from the lies of the French fascists in their droves and opposed the German occupation for what it was, brutal and exploitative. In November 1942, after the Allied forces had landed in North Africa, Hitler ordered his troops to cross into Vichy France and occupy it. Southern France was now to be run as a full puppet state of the Germans for the remainder of the war. Mussolini had long considered himself as senior to Hitler, but was increasingly forced into following the latter's abrasive policies as the 1930s wore on. In a desperate attempt to retain some initiative, he invaded Albania in 1939, quickly conquering the helpless country. Mussolini boasted that Italy's army and navy were strong enough to dominate the Mediterranean, and in 1940 he put this theory to the test, entering the Second World War before his country had finished its military build-up. The result was disaster after disaster, which forever ended Fascist Italy's claims to greatness. Italian conscripts, fighting far from home for causes in which few of them believed, surrendered in their droves to the British in North Africa and were even driven out of Greece by stubborn resistance. The most committed fascists were sent with Hitler's armies to the Soviet Union, where, short of supplies, they died in their thousands in the retreat from Moscow. The Germans treated their supposed allies with increasing disdain, taking over many of the functions of the Italian state. Allied bombing raids obliterated Italian industry even when materials were available for production. Italy had few tanks or anti-tank guns, clothing, food, vehicles and fuel were all scarce, and supplies could not be safely transported to North Africa or to Russia. Major strikes broke out in the cities, and communism and political Catholicism re-emerged as political forces within the country. In 1943, the US and the UK invaded Sicily and then the Italian peninsula itself. Mussolini was briefly overthrown. Rescued and returned to power by the Germans, the Italian dictator now ran a pathetic puppet state that would be run entirely at the whims of Berlin. Dreams of Roman glory had been vanquished. Hitler invaded neutral Yugoslavia in 1941 merely because the latter was adopting a slightly more pro-Allied policy. This invasion, codenamed Operation Punishment, included an extensive aerial bombardment of Belgrade for no real reason other than to inflict civilian casualties. Following the collapse of Yugoslavia, Croatians saw their opportunity to gain independence, resenting the influence that Serbs had enjoyed over the unified state in the 1920s and 30s. In April 1941, Germans and Italians set up the independent state of Croatia, which also controlled Bosnia and Herzegovina. Whilst the state was under occupation by the German and Italian armies, The Ustasa, headed by former lawyer Ante Pavlović, was put into power. The Ustasha was a fascist movement that, with the support of Mussolini, had been founded in 1929 to push for full independence for Croatia, and in 1934 had assassinated the Yugoslav king. Once in power, the Ustasha conscripted an army and began to fight the resistance groups that had sprung up in the countryside almost immediately. To make their state more purely Croatian, the Ustasha set about exterminating its Serb, Jewish, and Gypsy inhabitants with a brutality that shocked even the Germans and occasionally obliged the Italians to intervene against them. The Ustasa planned to eliminate Croatia's Serb minority, partly by converting them from orthodoxy to Catholicism, partly by expulsion, and partly by extermination. As many as 350,000 to 450,000 victims were killed in Ustasa massacres and in the notorious concentration camp at Jasenovac. Thousands of Croatians, sickened by the actions of their countrymen, joined the communist partisans of Josip Tito, a Croatian himself, who proclaimed a socialist Yugoslavia in which ethnic tensions would be ended forever. Slovaks had been in theory an equal part of Czechoslovakia, but had been treated patronizingly by the Czechs, who considered them uneducated and unsuited for self-governance. In March 1939, one day before German troops took over the Czech lands, Slovakia declared itself independent and became an ally of Germany. Slovakia's dictatorial president was the priest Josef Tiso, who had independence in domestic matters, but was forced to join Germany in foreign policy, such as in the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Slovakian authorities were active participants in the Holocaust, sending the vast majority of the country's Jewish population to death in the killing centers. The government even paid the Germans extra so that Jewish children could be taken away with their parents and killed. The Hungarians allied themselves with the Germans as a means to restore lands lost in the Treaty of Trianon in 1919. In June 1940, the Hungarian leaders compelled a reluctant Germany to cede to Hungary northern Transylvania, which had been given to the Romanians, in return for allowing German troops to cross Hungarian territory. In November 1940, the Hungarians entered into an alliance with the Germans and the Italians. Hungary refused to join in the attack against Yugoslavia and occupied the ex-Hungarian areas of the country. Hungary's leaders were not fascists, but believed that a German victory in the war was inevitable and wanted to be on the winning side. Believing in a quick German victory, they sent their forces east in the invasion of the Soviet Union, a terrible error as the war dragged on and thousands of Hungarians were killed. Secretly, the Hungarian leadership promised to surrender to the West once Western forces came near. Hitler eventually instituted a coup which placed the Hungarian fascists fully in charge. In September 1940, Romanian fascists, known as the Iron Guard, forced the decadent King Carol to abdicate, and General Ion Antonescu, who was not a member of the Guard himself, established a semi-fascist state. The Iron Guard thrived on anti-Semitism and a strange mystical nationalism, focusing around the iconography of the Orthodox Church. Despite their shared hatred for democracy, the Guard and Antonescu went to war together in 1941, with Antonescu coming out victorious and destroying the Guard as a political force. Antonescu enthusiastically joined in the German invasion of the Soviet Union in order to gain back Bessarabia and northern Bukovina and to end the Soviet threat once and for all. But he committed too much Romanian manpower and resources to the German war effort, the consequences of which proved disastrous, as seen when the Romanian units were obliterated at the Battle of Stalingrad. Finland was invaded by the Soviet Union in 1939 due to its close proximity to St. Petersburg, which was now named Leningrad. Despite fighting bravely against hopeless odds, the Finns were forced to cede much of their territory to Stalin the following year. Finland then joined the Nazis in their invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 in what became known in Finland as the Continuation War. The Finnish government did not participate in the murder of the Jews, and the Western Allies did not declare war against Finland, considering the Finns to be in a separate war with the Soviets. Finland also remained a democracy and never fell to a fascist or even an authoritarian coup. Germany's allies quickly became disillusioned by the reality of German rule. Rather than listen to his partners, Hitler only cared how much men and resources that they could supply him for his wars, particularly his aggressive race war with the Soviet Union. As the reality of the slave labor camps and the murder of the Jews became known, the Nazis lost much support in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, however, fears of communism and the Soviet Union ensured that fascism experienced a degree of popular support until the end of the war. It was only once the Soviet armies approached in 1944 that the Germans' allies began to rise up in dissent. We shall explore this phenomenon in tomorrow's lecture as we follow the Soviet advance west.